We're going to be talking about opera in Africa, and I often work with people in other parts of the world who wonder why a boy from Africa would make opera. And so I want to posit a few ideas about why that might be and how it arrives here. But I'll first put into the room the framing devices that I think through. The first is to think with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the great Kenyan dramatist and author, who says memory is what makes us who we are, firstly. And then he says that the first act that was committed by the colonial forces when they arrived to dominate Africa was to erase the memory of the indigenous population. The second act was to insert a memory of the arrival of the colonial forces. And that results, obviously, in whenever indigenous people are spoken to and referenced, the idea that history begins with the arrival of the visitors. And that shifts then indigenous knowledge systems, questions, aesthetics to the periphery. And so I'm exploring this, and I'll tell you a story that relates to work that I have come into contact with from the University of Cape Town, who have been in the past great collaborators of mine. An opera school that operates there happens to train some of the best opera singers who work in the world today. Many of them are black, many of them are from the periphery, from the township. And so the presentation today is thinking about why so many of the people who want to sing in this way come from these environments where there's no actual formal musical training, and particularly no formal love or stated desire to be a classical performer. And yet the voices exist, and the voices, when they perform in places like La Scala in the north, in Italy and other places, people call them bel canto voices, Italianate voices, and there are many reasons for that. But I'm going to begin this not by talking so much, but by introducing you to a dear friend of mine, a sister who I've worked with for many years. Her name is Tina Mene, and she's a soprano based here in Kailicha. This is an aria that I wrote in, I'd say, 2015 or so. It was part of an opera adaptation of the book Heart of Redness by Zeksimda. And the role Tina is singing for us is the lead role of Kukezwa, who has two lives that are separated, I think, by a period of 2 centuries. There's one Kukezwa who is from an indigenous Khoi community, and there's another Kukezwa 200 years later or so, who is the child of the Xhosa royal clan. But in the interim, a lot has been lost. A lot of memory, and therefore ways of seeing, ways of knowing has been erased. And she's making an argument about recuperating what is possible to recuperate.
One was accused of abusing Ubuti. The twins have been brought up to honor one tradition that was set apart. Twin and his wife were forced to account.
thought to be unclean.
They tried to unravel.
No one heard.
Fear and doubt and evil have arrived inside the home of our King. That is his name. He was lord of many people, ruler of the great palace of Usahili. He bore two sons, twin and twin, where the father died.
Their father died.
He was assailed by the British men of war.
British men of war.
Though the twins had been brought up to honor all people, they sought revenge.
They sought revenge.
Sought to appease the one who loved
Beneath the ground.
ancestors.
Kamada.
The Lord of all people. Into this home I was born. My name is Kukizu, child of the ancestor whose name was servant to serve a king.
She's a child born to me.
I am chosen one. I thread to tread and play they'd kill us slay, waiting on judgment day.
Judgment day, our salvation.
I am daughter of Tosa, granddaughter of the Koi, leader of the angry.
The angry, we wait for judgment day.
Many years have passed. I've been waiting here behind you, soon to push.
This is where we saw
them. There's strangers in the midst, elders of Koloha, dearly departed king. Matters of our past, we weep for you. There was a man are slain by the British men of war.
British men of war.
In our hearts you remain. We honor you and all our elders. May you rest in peace.
Tina Mene. The impulse to make opera was not something natural for me. I've now become a fully fledged opera composer, and I've written a few pieces and had the fortune of having a number of them performed in different spaces, and I work quite closely with the Dutch National Opera most recently. And I'm always in the position of being the composer from elsewhere, from the periphery, coming and speaking a central language. I often get asked, well, how does it happen that someone from Soweto is interested in this art form, because it's the quintessential European art form? To which I answer, well, it arrived in South Africa during the colonial era. It came with missionary teachers, and by the 18th century, maybe more than 19th century, the most up-to-date public offerings of opera were being shared here in this country. And so people were learning the arias of Verdi, Wagner, and whoever else was outputting at that time, within the same period as the Europeans were learning it. And people here were accessing it as material that was current, that was contemporary, very much like how people think we now have the privilege through the internet, right? Things were very quick to move, also at that time, relatively speaking. And so many communities were learning these arias, but were also still retaining a shadow of what musical practice would have been. One particular figure that is important is Charlotte Maxeke, who is known for many in South Africa as the first person to acquire a science degree. She earned a BSc from Wilberforce University at the turn of the 20th century. She was studying with W.E.B. Du Bois, and she had been invited really as a result of having been on tour in the 1890s with what was called then the African Jubilee Choir. Now, the African Jubilee Choir was mainly a group of people, singers, who came through missionary schooling, were based in Kimberley of the 1800s, and they were learning all of these different world languages and different world systems and ways of making, ways of knowing. So they were performing both indigenous African music as well as these operatic materials, these classical songs or art songs as they're called. And they were invited by what history tells us was a rather shady producer character from London, who invited them to do a tour to the UK, whereupon they were promised great fame and riches. But in fact, it seems the whole trip was a scam. They lived in the UK for about 2 years, also managed to then tour around different parts of Europe. Apparently got to perform for Queen Victoria. And she was storied in the newspapers because she became the spokesperson for this troupe, this entity. And some newspaper articles that scholars have quoted talk about how she was both praised and denigrated for being a corrupted African, because she articulated Africanity but actually was too good at expressing her European influence. That was seen as suspicious because it wasn't believed to be authentic. And she argued back about what was her true intention, what was her true self in this regard. And they were being asked within months to dress differently, so they would put on skins, they would put on African behaviors in order to impress the Europeans in a way that was more aligned with stereotypes of the time. And she was pushing back against this, and she became part of the mutiny that was set up in this group to say we won't continue doing this work any further. But she wanted to go and study further. She wanted herself and her sister Katie to go study. And the opportunity they had in the UK was to encounter a group of American scholars who were visiting the UK at the same time. These American scholars happened to be from Wilberforce. They introduced her to the possibility to gain a scholarship. She wins the scholarship, goes and studies in the US, and that's how she becomes the first person to acquire this degree. But when she comes back to South Africa, she's also one of the first people to set up workerist communities. So black woman at the turn of the 19th century becomes the first person to organize workers in the different communities around mining in different parts of the country. She is a figure that I think represents the hybrid nature of who and what we've become. So when South Africans talk today about being both indigenous people but also people of the world, and I would argue a lot of practitioners of opera have this kind of double, maybe even triple consciousness, which Du Bois spoke about. And in the society that I've worked in the arts here, I remember I was part of the advisory panel of the National Arts Council some years ago now. And there was always a reticence around supporting this art form because it's considered foreign and an imposition from the colonial era. But there seems to be very little appetite for thinking through why, in fact, we have voices like Tina's. Tina grew up the road from here in Khayelitsha. And I've had long conversations with Tina about how she comes to opera. My understanding from the stories that I've heard from Tina and other collaborators we have is this was a tradition that was imbibed through different platforms, mainly from the church, because I don't know if any of you have been to a church in the townships here, but their voices are rather large, and they are doing this hybrid performance always in every piece of performance they have. And those voices are a very good training ground. They're not understood by the opera school as a formal musical training ground, but in fact I argue a lot in my work that in fact this is a fundamentally well-oiled musical training machine. The argument isn't necessarily easy to make at university, because what happens when young people enter the academy is they are in some ways taught to leave their baggage at the door. And baggage in this case means they are practices, they are historical inheritances. So the idea of the epistemology of the township is disregarded, and whether or not it has had influence in how the operatic voice is acquired is not necessarily centered or elevated. Except none of these students arrive at the university as tabula rasa, right? They come with knowledge, they come with abilities. Of course, they acquire new skill, new possibilities. So the work that I do centers around privileging what people come with, but also finding a way to work with people who have trained by ear, who don't necessarily have book learning, but who have a facility with learning orally. And often the companies that I work with bring together these two types of knowledge. And it's in the bringing together of the two that a third or perhaps fourth language is generated, which allows us to do hybrid work that can sound both operatic but also other I think this is an interesting model to make work that then speaks differently about who we have decided to be. If what Ngugi says is the memory has been wiped, and where we are living now is a construct of a memory that has been inserted, and that begins a way of knowing the world. Perhaps we are unable to recuperate the origin, and because that's unavailable, we have to invent a new possible future by really leaning into hybridity. So a lot of the work that I do is intentionally multidisciplinary, multilingual, and by lingual here I'm talking about different musical languages. Hopefully this is a way of arriving at a new understanding of how opera can be spoken of in the context of an indigenous or indigenized practice. I'm part of something called BORN, the Black Opera Network, where the argument that is being made is opera has been alive for 400 years, not by insisting on itself as a practice of purity, so the practice isn't hermetically sealed, but the practice in fact is rather vampirical. It like the Brazilians talk about antropofagismo. It eats influences from elsewhere. And the eating, if we think with the Brazilians from the Amazon, the eating of, say, the enemy, the foreigner, the other, imbues you with the powers of the enemy, the foreigner, the other. And in that way guarantees your ability to survive a world that has been inflected through miscegenation. It becomes, for me, a lens of a way of thinking about South African society, which includes many different ways of seeing, many different ways of knowing. So it's not just the economic strata that we have, but the strata of culture. And culture necessarily, well, isn't necessarily limited to what people look like, but it's also the way people know and understand the world and therefore move forward and how they imagine what's possible in the future.
Kyahana, Kyamele Zohoteki, Linankatsusa, Linankatsusa. Kyahana, Kyamele Zohoteki, Linankatsusa, Linankatsusa. Kyahana, Kyamele Zohoteki, Linankatsusa, Linankatsusa. Ekyana kyamele tsohoti linnankatsusa linnankatsusa bona nke mohula ka mosela utlwang ke mohlotse o la ka ke lesea bona ke mohula ka mosela utlwang ke mohlotse o la ka ke lesea Ekyana kyamele zoteke linnankatsusa linnankatsusa Ekyana kyamele zoteke linnankatsusa dimu lenangautosa. Hey, Gahana, Yamele Zote, lenangautosa. Bona, Gemo Hula Gamose. Utwange Moshose, Hula Kakelesea. Bonange Mohula Gamose. Utwange Moshose, Hula Kakelesea. Badute. Banco babanco 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 batuso. Geboma. Batsa banghuli swa. Badute. Banco batuso. Gebomang Bata Banghuliswa Arefate Le Bodile Bale Shebi Hali Peha Bachologata Le Lukile Bale Rekile Kadifela Barefate Le Bodile Bale shebile hali peha bachologata se le lokile bale rekile kadi fela Ekahana Kamele Tohote Lenangautusa Ekahana Kamele Tohote Lenangautusa Ekahana Kamele Tohote Tusa Ekahana Kamele Tohote Lenangautusa
I'm interested in you taking us through your musical journey. How did you find yourself in opera? And I remember you did training in Italy.
Yes.
Tell us about that. What happened?
The journey for me starts in Soweto, born in a time of the ructions in the student uprising in the 70s, and experiencing how song and chant were very central to how we understood the revolt. I spoke last time about here at the festival about how protest is the language of our uprising, and song and chant are very central to that. A figure like Abdullah Ibrahim talks about South Africa is the only country in the world that won a revolution in 4-part harmony. And so, again, this is a statement about hybridity. Firstly, four-part harmony reflects the singing nature of our people. And I grew up raised in choirs, community choirs, school choirs. And also, four-part harmony is something that is introduced here through colonial imposition and missionary schooling. So the soprano, the alto, the tenor, and the bass, as a form of writing, becomes something that literally connects us to Western civilization. And choirs, for me, were a way of understanding, firstly, myself and understanding my world and my context. But in the 80s, because we were all being chased by the apartheid system, I became one of those kids who started running because I got on some list of people associated with...
We're completely surprised by that.
And you know, it wasn't even my fault, right? I was on that list because I was associated with people who were on the dangerous list. As a result, we were all becoming very politicized at a very young age. And so my first exit from Soweto comes when I had to leave in 85 because our high schools were not operational necessarily, and because I kept being beaten by the police. So my father says to me, well, we'll send you off, and firstly to the Free State, which wasn't a very free state for us at the time to live with relatives. And after that, traveling, and we used to spend quite a lot of time in Botswana, where my grandparents had gone into a self-imposed exile. But they were kicked out of this haven because one of the people on that wanted list happened to be an uncle who was trading and collecting an arms
I think
cache.
you can begin to see a picture emerge.
Right. So then I come back to Johannesburg. My mother sees a post in the newspaper for a scholarship that takes one to different parts of the world. And she says, you should apply. And I happen to have reasonably good results. I applied, not thinking much of it, won a scholarship, and I was sent off to Italy. I arrived there at 16. I didn't know anybody. And the only way I could survive in Italy, remember, Italy was never a successful colonial nation. And the problem with...
The Ethiopians agree.
Yes. I'm sure. The Ethiopians very proudly will tell you about Menelik the First, Menelik the Second, and we defeated the Italians with just one cannon gun at the Battle of Adwa, right? And so I arrive in this place that has no facility with the other. I come from the far periphery. The way I look, my whole tradition is not particularly understood or welcome. So the only way to survive was to find home. And the home was in the choir. And I happened to join the choir of my master, Piero Poklen, who is now late, was also a very skilled composer of madrigals. Madrigals are old pre-Baroque music, in fact, pre-classical. So what becomes later a formalized tradition was very much a folk tradition. And he invited me to join this troupe. I fell in love with this tradition because the voices there, those Italian voices, sounded very indigenous to me. They sounded very similar to our voices. And that was for me a way of belonging. And that was my trajectory. Didn't like opera very much. I found it ridiculous how people like, with these kinds of voices, well, why are you doing that? Just sing normally, you know? We sing normally. And they are always full of languages you don't understand. You don't understand why people are crying and dying. And there's so much blood always, and it's like a complete mayhem and chaos.
I love you, you don't love me, so I kill myself.
Yeah.
That's basically opera.
Yeah. And some people who are dead come back to sing from the dead, like in Don Carlos. He's like, why? How would a dead individual wake up? And then I realized at some point when I was firstly meeting people like Tina, who are practitioners of this art form, that there are many people who practice opera in the periphery. Many of them have never been to the opera house at Artscape, where I used to also serve on the board. And so my understanding was some part of people who come into opera from the communities that we come from are being taught that what they bring is not all desirable. It's just your voice we want. We don't want your ideas. We don't want your body. We don't want your whole look. In fact, if you could sing behind a curtain, that might even improve your chances. I don't know. Maybe that's being a bit unfair. I don't want to be unkind. But it does feel like that. It does feel like people are being treated as just these abstracted, vocalizing objects. And so my work became very much about trying to understand the societal context of these voices and how they communicate power relations, how they communicate selfhood, and how they think through world making. So that's why I fell into opera, really.
One of the things that struck me when I first came to South Africa in April 1992, was just being immersed for the first time directly in the music of the townships, and when I follow my friends back to their ancestral villages for family ceremonies and so on, that people here have a certain facility for the voice, where everybody automatically, it seemed, sort of knew where to place themselves in the register. Yeah. And they just harmoniously all begin together. We didn't have that in West Africa. We had the acoustic instruments, the kora, the drums, various kinds of drums that I grew up with. So I saw that very dramatic difference in musical forms just by listening to people here. You go to a wedding in the township here, you have not had beautiful music in your life until you do that. And these are not people who are trained in any music schools and so on. Yeah. What's the origin of that?
I have no idea what the origin is, but I know that it's pervasive. I mean, we are a singing nation. Our identity is through the voice, particularly the singing voice. Some people go as far as to say we sing for whatever possible excuse. We sing when we're happy, we sing when we're sad. There's songs for working, there's songs for mourning, songs for being bored, songs for being excited, songs about songs.
Songs of protest.
Songs of protest. I think the voice, the singing voice, is our national instrument, which is confusing for many people who, for example, come from other parts of the world who say, play me some African music. And if you sing, then they say, but there's no drum, there's no rhythmic patterning. But in fact, our people are very much singers. So much, in fact, that it took me a long time to convince my family members that I had a profession. People would say to me, what do you do? I'd say, well, I make music and I sing. You sing and people pay you for that? I say, yes. And it took a while. My mother, I was already working. It was easily 15 years I'd already been a professional musician and performer. My mother saw an article about some work I was doing in the paper. And my money has been used to fund my parents to a large extent. And my mother would look at the paper and she'd say, this is very nice. One day you'll be professional. I'm going to play you a love song, I think. Slept in my own skin. Since I met you, I have lost my wind. A part of me is overtaken by shadows that brighten up the night. The sight of you makes me begin wanting to own this love again. I don't know how long I'll pretend not to notice you inside my dream. You're the song I want to sing when the sun sets
the horizon of flame. Ah, ba 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 ba. When I'm with you, I have no skin. My desire, like a pen, writes the words to all the secrets I have harbored. I'm already warm. Lay your heavy head on my shoulder. Allow your need to grow bolder. I have in me the power to make believe you're all my own. You're the song I want to sing when the sun sets the horizon aflame. Flame, 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 flame.
So, you were talking about hybridity, and I was just thinking about this now, about how music travels and how musical forms travel, are adapted, digested, and then exported somewhere else. And the story that illustrates that most powerfully for me is how Hugh Masekela got his first trumpet. Right? So Hugh Masekela was in this little band that Father Trevor Huddleston had put together in the township, and Louis Armstrong is sitting in his house in Queens, New York, one fine Sunday morning, opened the New York Times and read about this Father Trevor Huddleston and this group of young boys in what is now called Triumph, Sophia Town, who have formed a band and so on. So he goes into his basement and collects all his old instruments, puts them in a trunk, and ships them to this Father Trevor Huddleston. Now, Hugh Masekela happens to be with him the day the trunk was delivered, so he opens the trunk, and the first thing on top of the pile was this old trumpet from Louis Armstrong, which he handed to Hugh Masekela, the teenage Hugh Masekela. And there's that famous picture where he's holding the trumpet and he jumps like that. So look at the journey of that music that came with the slaves from West Africa, becomes blues, becomes jazz in America, and travels back to South Africa to deliver a trumpet into the hands of a teenage Hugh Masekela. Yeah. Is that not the way culture moves in the world, and that we cannot really say that something belongs to one person rather than a shared heritage of humanity?
Yeah, I do believe that this is in fact true, but there are people who will argue. And so, for example, Abdullah Ibrahim says we are the only country to win a liberation in 4-part harmony. People in Georgia, in East Europe, beg to differ because they also sing. It's also a very strong tradition, so we have these possessive.
It's like the Somalis thinking they're the world's greatest poets. And the Chileans will beg to differ.
Right? You see?
But I think it's all a misunderstanding. I think we are a people of exchange, and those exchanges are older than our living memory. And I think it's worthwhile humbling ourselves and thinking through artifacts that we haven't yet understood as indicative of our shared history. I mean, archaeology often brings up all kinds of confusing questions. And then the practice is to deny those until they are proved undeniable, and it's becoming not welcome to push against certain academic theories and boundaries. But I think that's shifting. I think with the way the world is understanding how the perspective of those who know, and particularly those who know everything and can educate others, the idea of the grand narrative is no longer sellable. Most people don't believe necessarily that it's only the experts who have the knowledge available. I think what's happening, what people think of as fractured knowledges at the periphery, are going to become numerous, and in that reality, all of us will have an opportunity, I think, to both reflect on the things that we have in common, but also the things that have always been traded. No one knows who originated them, but perhaps we can find a reason for sharing them in I guess, more interesting and compassionate ways.
So I wanted you to share your story of your journey with Black Sunshine. Was that an attempt to let your mother know that you did have a job? and then it leads to our second question, because in art, you appreciate art when you learn how to look. And the more you experience art, the better you learn at become at looking. In the same way, when I listen to your music, how do we become better listeners? How do we learn how to listen in a way that we can experience more meaning?
Yeah. Black Sunshine, I didn't know, firstly, would be read as necessarily popular music or accessible music. We were two guys who lived in Yeovil at the time. We happened to have two acoustic guitars, and my collaborator is the child of Malawians who were shipped off into exile during the Kamuzubanda era. And he was trying to come back to Africa to find his home. And I had come back from Italy trying to remember and recuperate home in a certain way. So we had a lot to share and exchange. We happened to have two guitars, acoustic guitars, at a time when everybody was using computers and samplers and machines to make kwaito, right? And so we became an aberration. We were those, people would call us the two weirdos from the hood. In fact, Brahui used to call us the Simon and Garfunkel of the jungle. And I would say to him, Ayubi, you can't say that, you know? He never took advice. But we were very lucky that became as popular as it was. So I didn't actually know that would be generating the funds to convince my mother that I had a profession. Yeah. Your question about listening, I think listening is an acquired taste. And it's not something that you would expect, because those of us who come from oral cultures imagine that orality is something that is what we understand as the passing down of possibility, the passing down of knowledges. So we listen very attentively in a particular way. Perhaps we're losing an ability to listen deeply. And there are many factors to this, many realities in our world today that contribute to us being not very good listeners anymore. Partly because a lot of people these days are interested in expressing their opinion and their individuality first, before listening. I work with choirs a lot, and choirs for me are a really interesting technique. It's a really interesting machine for thinking about how communities can be built better. Because choral practice centers around listening, not so much about you singing well as an individual. What matters very much more is how well you listen to the people to the right of you, to the left of you, behind you, in front of you, so that you can tune yourself and meld your voice with them. And that practice is something we still have very, very strongly in our communities, and it's the basis of operatic voices, but it's also the basis of many other styles, including kwaito that we make. But I think developing listening capacity is about practice. It's like a muscle that you train in the gym. The more you listen to the type of music that stretches your boundaries, the more curious you are as a person who listens, the more legible and available material becomes. I think what's often lacking is curiosity. And I think the curiosity is probably the birthing point of imagination. I don't understand how we get to imagine better unless we question better.
Can you rethink your social media persona as
Which does not exist.
which does not exist? I mean, our sister here, none of us know her. She should be a national treasure, right? Yourself. I mean, so how do you change even the perception of what a South African singer is? I mean, a simple thing, like Instagram.
I'll leave you to that one.
Yeah, as they say in the streets, shots fired. I think my personality doesn't suit the internet. In a way that is programmed and edited and presented by me. Because I'm interested in things that are long form. I'm interested in things that take nuance into account. I'm interested in meanders. And I find the internet weird. I feel a bit like when I first introduced my father to the internet, right? I said, my father, come meet the internet. Brought him my computer, my laptop. And he wanted to read the newspaper. He couldn't read it because he couldn't, there were too many images. This was late 90s, right? He couldn't distinguish between advertism, news items, and he saw pictures, colors, all kind of graphics that were moving about. And he said, shut the thing. Tell me what they're saying and just shut it. Right? I'm not that bad, so I'm not entirely Luddite. But the things that I'm interested in need a lot of time. So I'm interested in a lot of reading, a lot of researching and threading. If I did the internet, I would have less time to do that. So I have to privilege what supports my own personality. The answer that Anki gave this morning, which I really support, is, making yourself an icon is assisting the project of making you invisible and voiceless almost. So you become a figure. I know we disagree with that, but the figure doesn't necessarily allow for the things that the figure says. You become a representation. I don't know that is the only truth. I'm not proposing that there's a truth here. I'm just saying it doesn't suit my personality. I have lots of people who tell me constantly that I have an Instagram hashtag. And so I say, do it, send it to the Instagram hashtag. But I don't have the space to manage that. This is something I didn't write, actually. This is a hymn. Which I've appropriated and repurposed. Sote di enseki wena modimo reboka wena sote di enseki wena o dimo reboka o dimo reboka wena reboka. I realized I can't play a song that was written by somebody else. This was written by Mene Zifeza. You know this? This is a song called You Ain't Never Gonna Know Me, Though You Think You Know Me. Fashion, fashioning. Hard time living in. Fashion, fashioning. Hard time living in. Yeah, yeah, uh-huh. Fashion, fashioning. Hard time living in. Fashion, fashioning. Uh-uh. Uh-uh. Uh-huh. Uh-uh. So rebo ka we modimo rebo ka wena rebo ka tsohle 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 di entswe ke wena modimo rebo